G'day, welcome to True Blue Conversations. I'm Adam Blum. Today I'm coming to you live from the Australian War Memorial, and I have a very, very special guest. I have the director of the War Memorial, Matt Anderson PSM, and he's joined us today to talk about himself as the director, what he does, and also the redevelopment that is happening at the Australian War Memorial right now. So Matt Anderson, thank you so much for coming on True Blue Conversations.
G'day, Adam. Thank you, and thank you for what you do to tell stories of this great country of ours.
No, thank you. So, Matt, prior to you becoming involved with the Australian War Memorial, what did you feel that, and how did the memorial represent to you? What were your feelings?
Well, I'd been coming here since I was about 10 years old. I grew up in Melbourne, and Mum and Dad were both primary school teachers, and this used to be a place we'd come. We would do the normal things visitors would do when they came to Canberra. We'd come to the War Memorial, we'd go to the Mint, go to Parliament House. Curiously, when you think of my career, my trajectory, Dad would also always take us through Duntroon. We'd drive through the gates of Duntroon, and he'd take us for a trip through the embassies in the embassy belt. Or as Dad used to say, let's go on a trip of the world, and we'd just drive through and I'd have to pick all the flags. So I would come to the War Memorial, and I'd come back to the War Memorial. Fast forward to being a cadet at the Royal Military College, this was a very safe place for a cadet. I had the honour of being here in 1988 when the Eternal Flame was lit on ANZAC Day. I had the honour of being here when Simpson and his donkey was unveiled. Later in life, I would parade in front of it. Much later in life, I would bring, as a diplomat, I'd bring heads of government, heads of state here. And of course, I've also, as a very amateur historian, used the research centre. So I've had so many different vectors and touch points with the memorial over my life that I had a real sense of its many functions. It is of course a memorial, but it is a museum and it is an archive, and I've used all those different elements of it. So I had probably a first-hand but a pretty deep understanding and apprenticeship about the significance of this place. And then, of course, as you travel, as I've been blessed to do, you realise that there is no place like this on earth, no other place like this on earth. It's remarkable, it's unique, and it's all testimony to the vision of Charles Bean.
Absolutely, and I think a very good point, and what you touch on there is that you've been, as you said, you've been well travelled, and you've been to the Western Front, you've been to Villers-Bretonneux, you've been to Ypres. You're right, they are sacred and special places, but there is no place like here in Canberra and being at this memorial.
Yeah, I had the honour once of standing here with Ambassador Kennedy and General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And you're standing in the presence of those two, and the General turns around to you and just says, I get it. I get what you're doing. This idea about, and this is what I would argue we do as good as, if not better than any other institution, is this idea about commemoration through understanding. That a visit to the memorial allows someone to understand how a name ended up on our roll of honour, how that unknown Australian soldier most likely would have died, the circumstances under which he enlisted, the nature of his service. But that's true for every campaign because of the way in which we tell our stories in our galleries, the way in which we always take it down to the individual soldier, sailor or aviator, so that we can actually tell stories in this place and commemorate with meaning and with genuine affection because of that understanding.
Well, it leads me to, so you, in 2020, you became the director of the Australian War Memorial after many years of, back as you said, you paraded here, and then did you ever envision that you would become the director, and how did that come about for you?
So I never, ever imagined I'd become the director, but how it came about was Brendan Nelson contacted me, the former director, contacted me, and one night I was in London at that stage working at the High Commission, And he sent me a text and just said, "Mate, can we talk in the morning?" And it was a Saturday night in London, and I was awake waiting. I was on pick-up duty of my two daughters from the train station. And I said, "Mate, I'm awake now." So he spared me a text. So he rang, and he just started the conversation by saying, "Oh, look, mate, you know how I'm leaving." And I know my immediate reaction was, yes, Brendan, I do. And I pity the person that follows you, because he had reimagined the War Memorial. He had repositioned the War Memorial. And he had also set it upon this path of the redevelopment, all terribly ambitious projects, and largely driven by him and by council and Kerry Stokes and others. So I genuinely meant that. I couldn't imagine who would follow in his wake.
Yep.
That was the first thing. And I'd also, bear in mind, had just been extended in London. I was on my sixth diplomatic posting and had just been extended in order to allow my then 17-year-old to finish year 13. And young Kate is the subject of, I think it's 6 schools in 4 countries. And so this was my promise to her to finish her schooling. She'd be allowed to do her year 13. And in the middle of that, Brendan said, "We'd like you to come home and do this." Now, I resisted, and you'll soon learn that resistance is futile with Brendan, and then had the full court press. Kerry Stokes contacted me. There was an international selection process, so the next thing, when I just said, "Look, I'm not saying no, but I can't imagine I'm up to that job." The recruiters contacted me amongst others, and then it was a formal process chaired by the Public Service Commissioner, involving an application and involving interviews and the usual referees checks and other bits and pieces. And I was and remain both honoured and surprised that I came out of that process.
So for people who aren't aware, Matt, what does a day-to-day look like for you as director of the War Memorial?
So I've been in this job more than nearly 4 years, and no 2 days have been the same. When I arrived, the memorial was actually closed to the public because of COVID. So my first task in my first month was to deliver, as the Prime Minister charged me with doing, "I want you to lead the nation's commemorations of ANZAC Day in a building that's closed to the public, where we will be encouraging people to gather on their driveways, their doorsteps, their farm gates, and light up the dawn." So that's what we did. So that was kind of almost day one. But typically, of course, because, and we'll speak later on about the development, we're in the midst of a major redevelopment. So a large part of my day is just making sure that we can do both things at the same time, that we can undertake 4 major infrastructure projects safely on site, while simultaneously opening up my doors to 980,000 visitors a year. That's my job, but of course I also have 299 staff, so my job as the CEO is to make sure that my staff understand the direction in which we're all headed, to give them the tools that they need to achieve that vision, that direction effectively, and also just ensure that we never lose sight of what our mission is, which is to lead the nation's commemoration and understanding of the Australian experience of war. So no 2 days are the same. Some days involve me as, someone once referred to me as the ambassador for the War Memorial. I could be taking a delegation, including the Ukrainian ambassador, through the War Memorial. I could be taking the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or I could be meeting a group of school kids at 8 o'clock in the morning and participating in a reading of the Ode and the laying of a wreath at the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. And then, of course, I could be involved in, issues around finance, issues around HR, issues around, budgeting or maintenance or occupational health and safety, and all those things that you can imagine someone running a major cultural institution has to do. Liaising with the other culturals. We have this Council of Australasian Museum Directors, and I'm a member of that. So just liaising with them on best practice. How do we tell stories? What's the best way to tell stories? Engaging with the tourism operators in Canberra, because we're also not just a memorial and museum, we're also a place that people visit. So how do I make sure that not only are my doors always open, that people know my doors are open and they know what's on at the Australian War Memorial? Responding to media inquiries, responding to letters from a concerned or approving public. everything in between.
So very very many different hats that you have to play, and you do them very well. And for you, Matt, how do you think that the Australian War Memorial has evolved since it was first envisioned by Charles Bean in terms of not only honouring the ANZACs of the Great War, but all those who have followed in the decades and deployments and conflicts until now?
Well, I think you make a really important point, is that Bean originally conceived of this in 1916. He wanted a place where families could come and grieve and mourn loved ones who were going to be buried on foreign shores. But he also wanted this to be a place where families could come to understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Now, conceived in 1916, but not opened, and also conceived as a First World War memorial, but it wasn't opened until November, Remembrance Day 1941. So we were already in the midst of the Second World War. So when it opened, they knew they were going to have to be a place where we told the story of the Second World War. And then in the 50s, Korea, well, let's make this the place that commemorates the Australian experience in all wars. So I think it is met and continues to meet the challenge that Bean has set down for us, to be a place where we honour those who have served and the families that love and support them, and it continues to be a place where people can come to understand what these men and women had endured. Now, that's been the truth and the case up to and including the Vietnam War, but then we ran out of space to tell the stories of those who have served subsequently. So that's what the development's about.
And for you, you work in a very special place, and some might say a spiritual place. Is there a particular section of the War Memorial that strongly resonates with you, and why?
Well, the Hall of Memory is where the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier is. And I think it's very hard to go past the fact that in the First World War, we only brought home two people. General Bridges, who, as a cadet, I used to commit to memory the inscription on his grave. And then 75 years later, we brought home the unknown Australian soldier. So I think as the place that embodies the notion of service before self, for me it would have to be the Hall of Memory and the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. But that is a part of the commemorative area, which lists the names of 103,000 of our fallen. The pool of reflection, where we genuinely ask people to pause and reflect on the nature of service before self. And then you can't visit the pool of reflection without passing through the gallery. So when you suddenly realise how this place is connected, but the most special place for me would be the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier, and to stand there. And I don't know if you know that we tried to make sense of the Great War when Charles Bean, basically gave himself a challenge. How, in 15 words or less, what did we learn about ourselves as a country, as a fighting force in that First World War? And we etched those in glass, and we made those 15 values, those 15 characteristics. So on a daily basis, I get to visit the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. I get to pause and look at those stained glass windows that were both designed and built by Napier Waller, who was an artist before the war, who lost his right arm at the Battle of Bullecourt, and who then taught himself to write with his left hand and to paint with his left hand, because he said an artist paints with his head, not with his hands. So when you're in that place and you're challenged by these values, you're challenged by the fighting values, or you're challenged by the societal values, or the values that they had said the First World War exposed of Australia for our youth and for endeavour. It's just a place of thought, it's a place of reverence, it's a place of quiet. And at different times of the day it has a very, very different feeling, but it always has that same weight, that same meaning, to know that the unknown Australian soldier from Adelaide Cemetery, just outside Villers-Bretonneux, is lying in that spot, that he's in a Tasmanian blackwood coffin. He has a bayonet on his chest, he has a sprig of wattle, and Private Coombs took a handful of dust from the Somme and placed it on his coffin and said, "You're home now, mate." You bring all that together every day. It's hard to go past it.
And I think, too, a great point you touch on, that no matter how bad your day is, you've got a beautiful spot that you can just walk over and reflect and realise how blessed we are to live in this beautiful country that we call home.
Well, not just visiting the tomb, no matter what sort of day I have, and all my days here are good, because I've got the most. I often say to people, other than being a husband and a father, this is the most important thing I'll ever do. But there are some days where, to have a healthy perspective, the best thing to do is to wander over at 4:30 of an afternoon, attend the last post ceremony, and that puts your day into perspective, because you may think you're having a bad day, but a bad day for others is in a forward operating base in Shawalikot. A bad day is being in the tail gunner of a Lancaster bomber. A bad day is being on the bridge of HMAS Australia, or being a prisoner of war on the Death March at Sandakan, or being on Pozieres. It just brings it back into perspective that we are so blessed to live in a country that we enjoy, but it's being gifted to us by others, and every single night I get to read or listen to the stories of one of those who's gifted it to us.
Absolutely. And you mentioned that the last post service at the Manning Gate, which both you and I in Belgium have been to. It's a very, very special and moving place, and laying a wreath and reciting the ode. However, I recently had the privilege of attending the last post at the Australian War Memorial for my own family members, two of my own family members that are on those walls. And you have led many last post services. Is there any story that stands out for you in all the stories that you've heard in your time being here and being involved in the last post?
It's almost an impossible question because the point of the last post ceremony is for us to go through, the 103,000 names on our roll of honour. It's going to take us 280 years to get through them all. We're 10 years down. And every one of them is unique, because every one of the women and men on our roll of honour enlisted to serve, or in some cases with our Vietnam veterans were conscripted to serve for different reasons. They came from different backgrounds. Some of them were born here, others chose to make Australia home. And then their experience of war was completely different. I think that's the thing that you reflect upon is, and the power of the roll of honour at the Australian War Memorial. They're equal in service and they're equal in death. There's no names, there's no post-nominals. I mean, Bean had originally envisaged that they would be grouped by areas of enlistment, so that someone from the district could come and see all the men from the district or women from the district who fell. But that was just too hard, and they're now listed by service, then by ship, and then by unit, and then by squadron. But there are always, in fact, it's not a single one, but I was standing, without going into the names of the fallen, but I stood there one day a couple of months ago, and there were 3 brothers who served on the Western Front. 2 of them came home, and this was a big family reunion, because people now are using the last post ceremony as an opportunity for families to gather and to rally around, and for families to meet each other for the first time at the commemorative area, big families across the country. And this was a large family gathering, and there would have been easily 40 of them at the last post, over 4 generations. And I just stood at the back and watched as they laid the wreaths, but I was suddenly struck not by those who were there, but by a generation of Australians who never were, because one of the boys didn't come home. So the entire family cohort were the family cohort of the brothers who did come home. And there were doctors, and there were lawyers, and there were engineers, and there were nurses, and there were policemen. And I was struck by the generation who weren't, as a consequence of the one who fell. So that was a moment. I had a remarkable last post once where I stood there and we were honouring Magpie 91, was a Canberra bomber that was shot down over Vietnam in 1970. And the brother of Pilot Officer Carver was there. And at the end of the last post ceremony, this was one of the last remains recovered from Vietnam, and he sort of shook my hand at the end of it, and he just said, "This is the funeral he never really had. This gives us closure, and the families can move on." Now you think about that 50 years on, it was an act of remembrance and commemoration at the Australian War Memorial that provides the family with the ability to move on, because they know that here he will live on forever, because here is the place where we will tell his story forever. So, they're just a couple. But every night, tonight we're honouring a 25-year-old who died in Flanders, a survivor of Pozières. We'll tell his story tonight. Family will be in attendance tonight. Typically now, because of the interest in the last post, it takes about 2.5 years for someone from expression of interest to having their story told. Cyril Sharpay is the young lieutenant tonight, who died in 1916, and tonight we not only will tell the story of how and where he died, but most importantly we'll tell the story of who he was when he lived, of the family that loved and supported him, and as long as we do that, as long as we honour him and tell his story, he won't have died in vain.
Absolutely. It's very, nearly brought me to tears actually with that you're right, it's a great point again you touch on with that soldier, the third brother that died, any hope of a future, of what he would go on and do, kids, all exactly what you've said. And that's when you do walk in those cemeteries, yes, it's a name that you see on a headstone. You don't know the story of what the family left back in Australia. So yeah, it's very special, and it's a very, as I say, it's a privilege to attend the last post. And any listener out there, if you're in Canberra, please attend the last post service at 4:45.
4:30 at the moment.
Oh,
We've
4:30
just brought it forward with everything that's going on. It's just easier for us to do it then. It gives us a chance to clear the galleries and get through our day. But and also ensures a greater sort of watching audience.
Absolutely. So you mentioned recently the War Memorial started a $550 million redevelopment. What is the purpose of the redevelopment, Matt, and what will be involved in once it's completed?
So the purpose of the redevelopment, and it's called Our Continuing Story, is because it was very, very clear that we had been remarkably successful in telling the story of First World War, Second World War, Korea, Malaya, Borneo and Vietnam. But subsequent operations, both peacekeeping operations and Afghanistan and Iraq and the deployments to the Gulf, maritime interdiction, were underdone. And I say underdone, that when I arrived, in 15 paces, you could get from the Vietnam Gallery to the Tarancot Wall, which our veterans from the Middle East would sign their name on. 15 paces. And most of the Afghanistan collection was in an exit corridor, which is just simply not good enough. Our modern veterans, frankly, deserve nothing less and have waited long enough to have their stories told in the same way and in the same place as those that have also worn our uniform. So that was the idea. I call this the Space Project, because what we're trying to do is create the space to tell the stories of contemporary service and contemporary operations. 63 peacekeeping missions. Australians have been deployed on peacekeeping every single day, including today, since 1947.
Yeah, right.
And so veterans of those peacekeeping missions deserve to come to a place where they can have their story told. The act that governs me says that I need to speak to the causes, the conduct and the consequences of our service. And we've been unable to do that because we haven't had the space. We're creating that space, and that's what it's about. It's about providing new galleries to tell those stories. It's also about the fact that the Australian War Memorial was built for £250,000 back in the day, fixed price, and it was built during the Great Depression. So you can only imagine that they possibly cut one or two corners back then. Well, we're fixing those corners. It wasn't designed with accessibility in mind, so we're making sure now that it is accessible, that you not only enter the Australian War Memorial up the commemorative steps, but you'll be able to come in at ground level if you're in a wheelchair, or if you've got a family or pushers or strollers or whatever else. It's making it more accessible. It's also designed to give us more gallery space for temporary exhibitions. You know, we have this thing now, the Napier Waller Art Prize, where every 2 years we encourage veterans and their families to actually express themselves through art, both for sort of therapeutic benefits, but also just for expressive, the benefits that accrue to people who actually seek, you know, forms of any form, you know this better than anyone. Yeah. The ability to communicate, whether it's through art or whether it's through writing or whether it's through song or dance or whatever. But in this case, through any medium, we're encouraging veterans to tell their stories, and you know, the Napier Waller Art Prize, for example, could go into our temporary galleries. We have 3 travelling exhibitions on the road right now. You know, Ink in the Lines, Action, Film and War, and Art in Conflict. And so when my job is to make the collection available to the nation, but when these travelling exhibitions come home, we should be able to put them on display in Canberra as well. Absolutely. So that's my job, is to create the space to get more of the collection out of Mitchell and on display. You ask, what will it house? Well, for your listeners, the most requested object in the collection is G for George, our Lancaster bomber. So the first thing that people should know is G for George is coming back. We'll have a reimagined Bomber Command exhibition, and we will put her with a V2 rocket from sort of Peenemünde in Holland. We will put her back with the Messerschmitt, but we'll tell the story. What's life on a base like? We'll have a diorama of RAF Waddington, so people can understand what an operational bombing command base was like. Because, of course, the most dangerous job for an Australian in the Second World War, statistically, was to be a member of Bomber Command. So we'll tell that story. The Kitty Hawk will be there. We'll tell the Battle of Milne Bay. Milne Bay is terribly important for us because it was the first place the Japanese Army, Imperial Japanese Army, was stopped on land by us at Milne Bay. So we'll tell that story. We'll tell the story of the Sydney versus the Emden again. We'll bring the Japanese midget submarines back, but tell them in a different way, put them at ground level so people can explore them. And for our contemporary veterans on that upper ANZAC hall, we will have a Chinook, and the Centaur will be there from Kandahar. The Kandahar workhorse will be there. But what we're determined to do is actually have the ramp down, so that veterans and their families and their friends can either be alone with their thoughts, with themselves, with their friends, with their families, and talk about their experience. And then downstairs, peacekeeping, Afghanistan and Iraq. And we'll still have the First World War and the Second World War, Korea, Malaya, Borneo and others. So it's designed to enable the memorial to catch up in our storytelling and our commemoration, because again, at the moment you can't understand how a name from Afghanistan got on the Roll of Honour, but you will soon be able to. Yep. Understand how the peacekeepers ended up there. You know, what were we doing on Nias Island when the Navy helicopter crashed? We'll be able to tell those stories in our galleries.
And I think it's great for the families, but it's also great for the wider public and the nation to understand those stories, because we can, as you say, you can walk through the World War I galleries, you can walk through the World War II galleries, and you can understand the conflicts, why we were there, what we were doing. It'd be great to do that right through now. That's fantastic. And when is it likely to be finished, Matt? When is it going to be back to the beautiful grounds that it used to be?
Oh, come on! So it's still pretty beautiful.
It is.
So I think the timelines that we are working to, and to give you an idea and give your listeners an idea, the crazy brave thing was to remain open during the construction. But how do we do that? There's no as great as Dr. Nelson was, he didn't leave me some handover notes about how to redevelop the memorial whilst remaining open. We've had to make that up as we go along. And we've excavated the equivalent of 50 Olympic swimming pools, 9,500 truck and trailer loads of dirt, whilst remaining open to the public, because we have to. Because we have a Roll of Honour, we have an unknown Australian soldier, we have galleries and people deserve and ask to come to this place to understand. So we kept it open. But the first timeline for us is ANZAC Day. The first aiming mark is to ensure that the parade ground is finished, so that veterans can actually commission it this ANZAC Day. That's our first aiming mark. Then the southern entrance. Now the southern entrance includes the shop and includes the orientation space. It's the old sort of forecourt area, but it's beneath that area. And it'll have our lecture theatre and other things there as well, the Captain Reg Saunders Gallery. They'll all be there, and that'll all be finished by the end of this year. Phase 2, or for those who have watched Maverick, Miracle number 2, is that we have the Bean building and the research centre. So we're actually building a research centre. Now, as we were building the research centre, because we are an archive as well, and we need to give families, friends, academics, movie makers, interested public ready access to the collection, to the diaries, to the letters and other things. So we're building a new research centre. But as we were doing that, Russia invaded the Ukraine, and gas prices and energy prices went through the roof, and so we received a $1.3 million gas bill, and that's not sustainable for this organisation. So we'd earlier looked, but we re-looked at the engineering around geothermal, and so as part of the redevelopment of that site where the research centre's going, is we have just installed the largest closed-loop geothermal system in the southern hemisphere. Wow! To heat and cool the building. So that's a pretty cool thing, right? That's Absolutely. Good for the environment, but most importantly, it also helps me run a memorial. You ask, what do I do? Well, I worry about money. I worry about where the money comes from, and that's something to do. So the research centre, that research centre, and that'll all be finished by the end of this year as well. Wow, so the end of 2024. By the end of 2025, ANZAC Hall and the Glaze Link will be finished, and I think then most people will look at the memorial and think that we're done. That's 3 major works packages, but by the end of 2025. 2,500 objects, everything from Lancaster bombers to FA-18 classic Hornets, to rigid hull inflatable boats, to submarines, to Kiowas, to 113s, will all be in ANZAC Hall, and people will think we're done. I'll know we're not done, because we'll still be tinkering around inside the main building and doing other works that need to be done, because the project is up to 2028, but the major muscle moves, if you like, will all be done by the end of 2025, and then we'll be still working on additional galleries and spaces at the front of the memorial up to 2028.
Wow! Yeah. So still 4 years to go. So.
But for your listeners, everything they'll want to see, I think, will be in place by the end of 2025.
No, fantastic. And you mentioned earlier that you were as you said, you were the Deputy High Commissioner to the United Kingdom,
yep.
And when you got a phone call to say, we want you back for this, and do you have any, so what did that job entail, and did you ever have the opportunity to meet the late Queen, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II?
Well, second part of the question first, yes, I had the honour to meet Her Majesty on several occasions, and it was a remarkable experience, because she was a delight to be with and to be around. Met her at Buckingham Palace a few times for various events, because one of my jobs, to answer the first part of the question, as the Deputy High Commissioner, in a way, we always appoint very, very senior people to London to be High Commissioners. And when I was there, I was honoured to work with both Alexander Downer and then George Brandis as their deputy. So in a way, I was the senior career public servant, senior career DFAT officer, and my job was to support the High Commissioner in the functioning of a very, very large multi-discipline, multi-agency mission at a remarkable time. I mean, when I arrived in London, they were in the middle of Brexit. Right? They had voted to leave, but they didn't know how they were going to leave. So I watched the United Kingdom go through that process, and the government work out that process to leave the European Union. So that was a fascinating time, but it was also a pretty confronting time, because one of the other jobs as a deputy is you find yourself with particular responsibilities for Australians in a cultural in a consular environment. And whilst I was there, we had the Borough Market attacks where Australians were killed. We had the Manchester bombing. We had the Westminster Bridge issue. We had a number of the Skripal. Not Skripal. We had the Salisbury chemical weapon attack. All those sorts of things were happening there. That meant that what people don't understand about London is, other than New York, it's possibly the largest gathering of diplomats in the world. So it's a very, very senior, serious diplomatic post, high intensity, a lot of work, a lot going on, Five Eyes, like-mindeds, lots of issues to pursue with our British government in particular. So that was my daily toil was a lot of political and economic work, a lot of trade-related work, a lot of consular work, a lot of cultural work, because certainly George Brandis in particular wanted to sort of reimagine how our two countries could work together in terms of that cultural offering, the season of culture as he called it. You also had some great things. We had a lot of visiting sporting teams. So the Australian cricket team would come to Australia House. The Australian athletics team would come to Australia House. All the Australian tennis players during Wimbledon would come to Australia House. Women's cricket team came to Australia House. You got to, it really was a terrible, and of course, and a lot of high-level visitors. So the Prime Minister would come. I had Choggum while I was there. Mm-hmm. So a lot of things going on. But it was both professionally and personally a remarkably enriching posting, both for the family, of course, because you're in London, but Europe's on your doorstep. Yep. But for me professionally, I couldn't have been in a more professionally intoxicating place.
And for you, you mentioned that you joined the military back in 1988. Yep. What have you learnt through your military service that has helped you to where you are today?
I think I often say to people that for me, I graduated from RMC in '88 and Royal Military College, and I still call it my finishing school. Right? I think what it taught me about the importance of teamwork, what it taught me about the importance of communication, what it taught me about Australia's place in the world. I think. As much as anything, I remember once I was in Samoa in 2007 to 2011, was our High Commissioner, and on the 29th of September we got hit by an 8.3 earthquake and a tsunami. And I remember the next day, as all of the wonderful Australian help arrived, these emergency response teams and doctors, surgeons, anaesthetists, paramedics, disaster victim identification people all sort of flooded in. They came in on Hercs and it was all sort of wonderful. But I remember walking in when they were all assembled, and I'd just been down to ground zero and was looking for some missing Australians, and sort of walked in there, and they'd all been talking amongst themselves, and they shut up as I walked in the room. And I remember two things. I remember the first thing I said was, as they looked at me expectantly, I said, I hope the person standing behind me knows what to do, because I was still making this thing up. Because it was personal. It was a personal, an island that you're living on, people that you love had just been devastated by a natural disaster. Mm-hmm. So it was very personal, but it was also very, very thankful that Australia had been the first to respond, the largest to respond. But the second thing you do, and there's that pregnant pause as they all look at you. What are you going to say? What are you going to do? And what the army teaches you is the military appreciation process, but they also teach you how to give a set of orders. And so I just sat there and I looked at them and I just wrote, the situation is this. Our mission is going to be this. How are we going to do it? Execution, admin log, command and sig, apparently I'm in charge, scary thought. And we got to it. And afterwards someone came up to me and said, how did you do that? And it was really instructive to me that at that time, when there was a lot unknown and a lot unknowable, mm-hmm. what I was able to fall back on as a frame of reference or as a structure to organise my thoughts was something I was taught in third class at the Royal Military College, and you use to this day.
and you still use it in, I'm sure, going into very important meetings. What's the situation? What's the mission? What's the execution? What's the admin? And I laugh because we use SMAX as well in the fire brigade. Right. So as soon as you said it, I went, yep, I know exactly what you're talking about. So.
And I didn't know I'd do that. I didn't instinctively. I didn't plan for that. I mean, I had my sort of talking points and other bits and pieces that I wanted, key messages I wanted to convey.
Yep.
About us all, sort of in one boat and rowing in the same direction. But very, very small post in the middle of the Pacific. I understood the nature of the challenge that we were embarked upon, but I didn't know that was just sitting there as a frame of ready reference, and just how useful it was going to be. Because it also gave, I am told, all those in the room a sense of confidence. This guy's thought about this, and we had a way forward.
And that's, as you say, muscle memory, going back to what you learnt back in third class at the Royal Military College.
Well, I also learned that flexibility is one of the 10 principles of war, and I use that heavily. And the team here know, I often say, it turns out that flexibility is also one of the principles of running a war memorial.
Very true, very true. Well, I know time is of the essence, and where I know how busy you are, and I want to thank you for coming on True Blue Conversations and giving us a little bit more background about you and sharing your story as the director. But there's a question that I want to finish with that I want to get your thoughts on is, what do you think of the term ANZAC? What does it mean to you, and how has it changed over the course of time from when we first shortened those words of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps back all those years ago?
When I think of the term ANZAC, I always think of the notion of service before self. The most important, that's what the term ANZAC embodies for me, that the person who is deserved of the term ANZAC is the person who is prepared to put the life and the welfare of the person next to them on the fire step in the trench in Gallipoli, or in the fuselage with them in a Lancaster bomber, or in a submarine with them, or in a pick a modern day piece of machinery. The idea that Forward Operating Base in Tarancot, for me the idea is, and it is timeless, it is those people who are prepared and are more concerned about the person alongside them than they are about themselves, and the achievement of the mission first. That's what I think of when I think of ANZAC. I think of that wonderful story of two blokes about to go over the top at Lone Pine,
complete mateship.
You and me, Bill here, him and me are mates.
Yep.
You blokes mind shifting up a bit, because him and me are mates and we're going over together.
Yep.
That's what ANZAC means to me. It means it is an embodiment of all those who are prepared to put service before self to achieve the national interest, and that it is timeless. That is, there is an unbroken line that runs for me from the Ascot landing boat in the First World War galleries to the Tarancot wall that our veterans sign when they come home from the Middle East area of operations today. There is an unbroken line, and through every gallery, through every story, what resonates to me are those who are prepared ultimately to pay the highest price, 103,000 of them, who have given their lives for us, and more importantly, given their lives for the person that was standing to the left or to the right.
And that's very, very powerful, and I think you've embodied the whole ANZAC meaning of what it means. And yeah, you're right that 103,000 names are on those walls, the Hall of Remembrance, to give us the freedom that you and I can sit in your office and enjoy having a conversation because of men and women who have been willing to sacrifice for the mate next to them. Yep. Very, it's nearly making me cry, Matt. And so I think that's a great way to finish the podcast. And as I said, I want to thank you for allowing me the time to come and sit down with you and record this. And thank you for the work that you continue to do as the director, and also your staff, and honouring all Australians who have ever pulled on a uniform, and as we said, 103,000 have made the ultimate sacrifice. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for coming on True Blue Conversations today. It's been an absolute honour and privilege to share your story.
Thanks, Adam. I know in my job I stand on the shoulders of giants. The staff, as you rightly acknowledged at the Australian War Memorial, are the ones who make this happen, the ones who preserve and conserve our collection, the ones who allow the stories to be told in the galleries, the ones who open our doors every day, in the midst of global pandemics, all the way through to the organised chaos that is the development of the Australian War Memorial. The staff are the true champions of this place because they allow us to tell a story every night. Tonight they will allow us to tell the story of Cyril, and every day we allow this nation to understand how much richer we are for the service and the sacrifice of the 2 million women and men who have worn this nation's uniform over the past century.
Absolutely. Director Matt Anderson PSM, thank you so much for coming on and sharing a little bit about what you do today. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.